Want to have a lot of fun, get fit, and help support a really meaningful cause this April? Join the 30-day Take On Addiction Fundraising Challenge. Just sign up to walk, run, cycle, or choose your own activity to raise money for Smart Recovery, a global leader in mutual support services that empowers people everywhere to take back control of their lives and gain total freedom from their addictions. Sign up is quick and easy. Create your monthly fundraising challenge, invite your friends, form teams, share your results, celebrate your accomplishments, and get in the best shape of your life, knowing you're helping Smart Recovery smash the stigma of addiction and heal individuals and their communities everywhere. What are you waiting for? Just go to takeonaddiction.org and start helping people everywhere lead life beyond addiction today.
Welcome, everyone. My name's Dr. Katie Witkiewitz. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico. And on behalf of the SMART Global Research Advisory Committee, I'm very pleased to chair the first annual SMART Recovery Research Webinar Series. And this webinar features members of the SMART Global Research Advisory Committee, providing an overview of SMART Recovery research to date, updates on the latest research, and to explore the future research on SMART Recovery. So very thrilled to have all of you joining and our speakers today. And we will start with Dr. Alison Beck, who's a clinical psychologist and trial coordinator in the School of Psychology at the University of Wollongong in Australia. She's joining us very early Australia time. So thank you, Alison. She's actually joining us from the future, which is kind of fun. So brilliant work by Dr. Beck. She will provide an overview and update of evidence for SMART Recovery. Thank you, Dr. Beck.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. Wonderful. Okay, I'm hoping that that's working. So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for everyone who's attended today. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we did a few years back now around the evidence for SMART Recovery, and also our upcoming update to that. So when we did this work, it was funded by the NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence in Mental Health and Substance Use. So we need to acknowledge very important our funder, our partner in SMART Recovery, and also the rest of the research team, because these projects are never done in isolation. So just to begin with, many of you are probably aware that mutual support is something that is incredibly important when it comes to people's experience of recovery. And I guess by recovery, I mean whatever that means to the individual. So being able to have that opportunity to have that social, that emotional, that informational support with other people who are going through similar things to you, it's really vital. So much so that it's something that's recommended by clinical guidelines. And 12-step approaches, so your Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and so forth. They're the types of mutual support. It's an organisation that's been around for an incredibly long time, perhaps one of the most well-known approaches. But I guess when it comes to treatment and support for anything. There's definitely no one size fits all. And for whatever reason, there's going to be some people who don't necessarily fit with a 12-step approach. And so it's really important to have alternatives that are available so that people can find the support that fits best for them. So that tailored service provision is something that's incredibly important. And so we have Smart Recovery, which is another type of mutual support. It's something that is informed by motivational interviewing and cognitive behaviour therapy. It's led by a trained facilitator, and it gives people that option to be able to work with others on helping them to change their behaviour. And so from the feedback that we receive from people who go to these groups, we know that it's something that's important and that's beneficial. But in terms of the actual hard evidence, back when we did our original review, at that point in time, no one had yet kind of pulled it together to get a bit of a sense of what the evidence was telling us, sort of hard data or facts. Because I guess when you're talking to healthcare professionals and saying, hey, are you willing to refer into this mutual support program? Oftentimes what people were coming up against was, well, what's the evidence for it? And so when we did this systematic review, which I'll talk through in a moment, that was one step in that direction of being able to provide people with the evidence for smart recovery. So we were particularly interested in understanding, is smart recovery something that promotes change in the severity of addictive behaviours and the consequences? Is it something that people find to be useful? Is there particular things that might make it more or less likely that people are going to find it to be useful? So is outcome influenced by things like how well people engage in the group or how often they attend, or is there other variables out there that might influence it? And what's the evidence for feasibility? So these were the three questions that we had going into the systematic review. So when I say systematic review, basically what we wanted to do is take a look at everything that was out there, irrespective of whether it had been published or not, take a really comprehensive look at the literature to see what had been investigated, what the studies were saying, and what we could take from it in terms of our understanding of the evidence for smart recovery. So this is the first time that it had been done, so we were really broad in our inclusion criteria. We're happy for any kind of sort of design. Didn't matter whether what smart recovery was being compared to, or who was attending, what was being measured, just so long as it told us something about people and how they engaged in the groups and what the outcomes were. So we started off with 972 studies from our very broad search and filtered it down, and eventually came up with 12 studies or 12 papers that told us something about how smart recovery works. Within those 12, many of them were survey-based research, so trying to get a bit of an idea around sort of descriptive type stuff. And then we also had 4 studies who did make a comparison to give us more definitive evidence around the impact that smart recovery was having. So in those 4 studies, we had one that was a randomized controlled trial. So you may be aware that that's the sort of, I guess, gold standard when it comes to being able to draw conclusions around how effective an intervention is. So in that randomized controlled trial, they had a web-based program that was based on smart recovery called Overcoming Addictions. And they put some people into that treatment arm. They compared it against some people who were only going to smart recovery, and then one treatment arm where they had people going to both. So they had those 3 arms and looking at the outcomes by comparing those. And one thing that was quite interesting about that study is that unfortunately they needed to abandon the arm where people were only going to the Overcoming Addictions program, because it meant that they weren't able to also go to smart recovery. So I guess that's that kind of anecdotal thing, that people wanted to have the option or the opportunity to be able to attend the groups. So that was one of the studies. One of the other comparisons was based around a partial inpatient, outpatient hospitalisation setting. That was done particularly, it was focused on patients with experience of concurrent mental health related conditions and addictive behaviours. And that one was a comparison between a smart recovery informed program plus smart recovery groups, and a 12-step informed program plus the 12-step groups. And then we also had a study that looked at within a correctional setting. And so they compared people who went through a correctional setting without doing any types of smart recovery groups against people who had done smart recovery groups or smart recovery plus what was a smart recovery informed program specific for people in correctional facilities. So in terms of our findings, we had, and I should say that the 4 studies, the mental health one was split across 2 papers, so that's why we had 4, but I've only talked to 3 types of studies. So the Overcoming Addictions program that was conducted in a community-based setting, and they did find that there was a significant reduction in alcohol, both in terms of the number of days abstinent as well as drinks per day and the consequences associated with alcohol use. So some of the treatment arms didn't differ, but what we're seeing is that smart recovery in and of itself can promote those changes. And then in the setting where we've got the co-occurring mental health and addictive behaviours, that one was a little bit more trickier to kind of tease out because the impact depended on the outcome that people were looking at. And so we had the AA-based group, that arm, that they had a better change in alcohol or likelihood of abstinence. Whereas on the flip side, in the smart recovery arm, we were seeing a stronger effect for things like functioning, hospitalisation, quality of life. But again, we're seeing that we've got some improvements across different types of mutual support. And then in our correctional setting, the odds of reoffending were significantly reduced. And when you had people who participated in the smart recovery groups on top of the ones that were informed by smart recovery, the Getting Smart plus the smart recovery, that almost sort of amplified the effect. So what we're seeing from this really early evidence is that it's supporting what we're hearing from participants, is that, you know, people are finding these groups to be useful to sort of make some of these really meaningful changes. When it came to our questions around treatment engagement and other types of process measures, the thing that came out most strongly was around attendance. So more sessions, more likely to get an effect was what was coming out in those early preliminary studies. And then we've also got other things around, for example, group cohesion. There was a study that Pete Kelly and his team did where people who were in groups where they rated the quality of facilitation more strongly, also experienced stronger group cohesion, which then seemed to have a knock-on effect in terms of their likelihood of using cognitive behaviour therapy skills, sort of taking those away from the groups and then using them. So there's some nice kind of interactions that could potentially be happening in the groups. And then in terms of feasibility, a lot of the evidence was speaking more towards attendance, likelihood of attending sessions, duration and involvement, those kind of things. So there wasn't too much out there at that point in time in terms of feasibility, a little bit of qualitative stuff, and at that point in time, no cost related things. So it's a little bit of a snapshot around some of the things that we learned around what it was saying for the effectiveness of smart recovery. But we also had a lot of really other important take-home messages that at that point in time, the research was mostly around alcohol. So even though there's a range of other addictive behaviours out there, a lot of the research did focus on alcohol. And in particular, things like opiates, for example, sort of non-prescription use of medications, and also smoking. There wasn't anything out there at that point in time. The other thing that was really, really tricky was that it's hard to compare studies because there's lots of big differences in the way that outcomes are measured and the way that, I guess, success is defined. So some studies might focus on the behaviour, and well, actually a lot of the studies focused on the behaviour, and there wasn't a lot out there around other types of outcomes. So although change in the behaviour in and of itself, obviously incredibly important, things like, you know, quality of life, for example, didn't come up too often. And one of the other things that we noticed wasn't there very much was around mental health. So with the exception of that, that body of work that was done in the co-occurring mental health system, there wasn't a lot of information out there around how smart recovery performs for people who also have co-occurring mental health conditions. And as we know, oftentimes these things go hand in hand. So there was this really neat opportunity to be able to think about these things and how they could potentially inform the future. And so we did this work back in 2015, 2016. And when we did our searches back then, we left it open. So we went from beginning of time up until 2016. So as I mentioned, we had 12 studies that we included. And when we've just recently run some preliminary searches, just from 2016 to now, we're already seeing around 17 or so that are likely to be added into the mix. So we've got additional evidence from that RCT that I spoke of. They've published some longer term outcomes, because I should mention that those original outcomes were just for, I shouldn't say just, were 3-month follow-up. So they provided important information for a shorter period of time. And now we've got evidence for a longer period of time. There's studies out there now that are looking at smart recovery versus other mutual support groups. So in our original review, oftentimes smart recovery was compared to 12-step approaches, whereas now we're seeing some comparisons emerge with other types of approaches as well. We've got some more evidence that's coming up around the characteristics of people who attend, their likelihood of engaging, and how these sorts of things might interact with outcome. We've got some tailoring that's happening for specific populations. So Elizabeth Dale, a researcher through University of Wollongong, has done some wonderful stuff around cultural sensitivity and the appropriateness of smart recovery for Indigenous populations. We've done some work around smart recovery for methamphetamine. And then we've also got Smart Track. So our team worked on being able to develop an app to be able to collect routine outcome monitoring data. So this was in follow-up to the systematic review. We wanted some way of being able to collect information from smart recovery participants in a sort of standard way to make it a bit easier to compare. And then there's a bunch of other citations where smart recovery is becoming increasingly cited as part of clinical guidelines. There's other types, it's being included in other types of reviews as well. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in this research, and we'll be working on it throughout the year. So hopefully we'll have an update, a further update on the evidence and what it's saying about smart recovery towards the end of the year, perhaps early next year. So definitely watch this space. And in summary, what we saw from that original review is that we do have preliminary evidence. It is in the direction of supporting what we hear from participants, in that people do find it to be useful for changing their behaviours, and that more recently we've seen an increase in the number of studies. So there's more momentum when it comes to the research, and we're definitely getting a greater diversity in the research questions and the outcome assessments that are actually being used. So yeah, really looking forward to working on that throughout the rest of the year. And for anyone who might be interested in a little bit more detail around the studies that I summarised earlier, you can go back to the original systematic review, and all of the studies are cited there. There's a bit more information in that review if you'd like. And yeah, any other questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A and we can go through them. But yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that beautiful overview of this work. It's really exciting. We did have one comment in the chat, which is somewhat of a question maybe, that the Audi prison study involved inmates with a history of any kind of addiction, and that results did not vary among them. Do you want to comment on that, or?
I'm not sure if we're speaking to the same research. The one that I was speaking about was a study by Blatch that was done in Australia, and that there was some analyses that they did run where the addition of the smart recovery groups made a stronger effect, as far as I'm aware. But I suspect we might be speaking about the wrong study, but not the wrong study, about a different study. But if that's not the case, please type back in.
Great, and it might be Aussie prison study, I'm thinking, so maybe the same one. Another question is, has a study been done with veterans and SMART?
At the point in time of doing the original review, no. I think that there may be some evidence in the most recent batch, but I do need to go through that in a little bit more detail. But yeah, it's definitely a neglected and important area.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ali. And just a reminder for those of you who have joined to use the Q&A with questions throughout. We will take them at the end, and we'll also invite all of our panelists to be together at the end to go through broader discussion and questions.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. John Kelly, who is professor of psychiatry and addiction medicine at Harvard Medical School and founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute. Dr. Kelly will be speaking to us today about who uses smart recovery, preliminary findings from a US longitudinal investigation of recovery and health. Dr. Kelly, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. I like it when you call me Dr. Kelly. It's great to see you, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks, Alison, for that great overview. Thank you for joining out of your busy schedule. We know you're all busy, but thank you for tuning in. My job today is I'm going to give you some initial findings on a study we're very excited about, which is a large prospective study where we're following up people who are starting a new recovery attempt from an alcohol use disorder, who affiliate with different mutual help organizations, or none, actually, as I'll show you, including Smart Recovery. So we can kind of look at kind of real world comparative effectiveness, if you will, or comparative engagement and selection into these different groups, including Smart Recovery. So as Alison already kind of stated, and it set me up nicely, is, we know these disorders are high volume, high burden disorders that contribute a large burden of disease in the population of most middle and high income countries. We're talking about alcohol and other drug use disorders. And they often require some kind of professional treatment for the more severe cases, as well as in those more severe clinical cases, some kind of ongoing recovery support and recovery management. Now, most of that historically has been played by 12-step organizations because they are by far the largest and the oldest. They've been around the longest. But now, really since the 1980s, there's been a flurry of new kids on the block, as it were, in terms of mutual help organizations, including Smart Recovery. I think this is really important to have these different entities available. Let me give you an analogy. I came up with this one recently, which I like, and it's a fitness center. So the question is, do fitness centers work to keep people fit? And I think the answer, most of us would say, well, yeah, of course they work to keep people fit, but you've got to go and you've got to work out regularly, right? You've got to go and do something at the fitness center. You can't just go and stand on the sidelines, or you have to go there and work out. But the challenge, of course, is how do you engage people in some kind of workout exercise? So what fitness centers do is they don't just have one thing, well, some do, but most fitness centers these days have what? They have a variety of different machines. They have a weight room, they have a free weight room, they've got all kinds of courts, they've got a swimming pool, they've got all kinds of things to attract and engage people in physical fitness activities to arrive at the same endpoint, which is physical fitness. But they know that not everybody wants to go to the weight room. So they provide a number of different things to attract and engage people to achieve that same physical fitness goal. That's a smart move. You could arguably make the same case about mutual help organizations. Do mutual help organizations work to keep people fit for recovery? I would argue, yes, we've got good evidence that they do work to help people fit for recovery. If you go, attend regularly, and you work out, you work the program that's prescribed in that mutual help organization. Again, the perennial challenge is how do you attract and engage people in mutual help organizations to get people fit for recovery? If I can draw this analogy, typically, historically, what we've done is said that everybody has to go to AA or 12-step because that's kind of the, that's the way to go. And not everybody wants to work out in the weight room. And so we need to provide an array of different kinds of recovery mutual aid options so that people can that will attract and engage different folks into recovery so they can get fit for recovery. In other words, the same developmental outcome, but in a way that can attract and engage more people. Now, 12-step has been successful at attracting and engaging some people, but not everybody. So we need a broader array. And of course, this is where Smart Recovery and groups like Smart, New Kids on the Block have been really important here in providing this different variety of options to get people attracted and engaged and fit for recovery, as it were. Now, we have a strong, very strong evidence base now, produced by, from the research over the last 30 years. It started back in 1990 after the Institute of Medicine called for more research, specifically on Alcoholics Anonymous and treatments designed to link patients with Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's been a flurry of clinical trials and cost-effectiveness studies and mechanisms research that's been done, particularly over the last 30 years, which we summarized in this Cochrane review, which is considered to be the gold standard in science, clinical science, in terms of summarizing evidence. It's a very rigorous protocol you have to go through to produce one of these reviews. And what we found here in this review, that AA for severe alcohol use disorder works very well. When clinicians link patients at random, when they're linked at random and compared to other kinds of interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, they do as well or better when it comes to abstinence and continuous remission on every single outcome, except remission and abstinence, where it does better. It also produces better cost effectiveness, so it's more cost effective. It reduces expensive healthcare services by keeping people in remission, and also it looks like it substitutes for other kinds of more professional counseling, which of course is paid for. So these free, ubiquitous indigenous recovery support services, in this case AA, can provide ongoing support for people with severe addiction problems in the communities in which they live for free over the long term. This is a public health freebie. I always refer to this as the closest thing public health has to a free lunch. We're lucky that we've got AA and now increasingly other kinds of resources in the community. How does AA do it? What have we learned about this particular mutual health group, AA, in terms of how it confers benefit over time? Well, turns out, using sophisticated mechanism studies, we find that AA mobilizes these therapeutic mechanisms, others too, but these are the ones that have been empirically supported. And in other words, AA works by helping people shift their social network and thereby increase to people who have that lived experience of how to stay sober and in recovery. And it does this by mobilizing coping skills, cognitive behavioral coping skills, abstinence, self-efficacy. It reduces impulsivity, it reduces craving. It increases spirituality, which can be a way for people to make meaning out of stress, for example. Now, I would argue that these same mechanisms are mobilized not just by AA, because these are not specific to AA, with perhaps the exception of spirituality, but rather would be mobilized by other groups of people with lived experience who are living lives in recovery, including, I would argue, smart recovery, when we get to do those studies. Now, I think the advantage here of these community-based mutual aid organizations like Smart Recovery, like AA, like others, is that they provide this indigenous, ubiquitous recovery support that's accessible, that's flexible, and that's freely available over the long term. Now, why is that important? When we talk about an illness which is susceptible to relapse over the long term, in severe cases, I'm talking about clinical cases here of addiction or severe alcohol or other drug use disorder. It's highlighted here in this timeline. If you look in the middle there, you can see it takes on average in adult clinical samples, roughly 8 years after people start seeking help for an alcohol or other drug use disorder to achieve that first year of full sustained remission, and about 4 to 5 treatment episodes. So that's quite a long time. What's also noteworthy, if you look on the right-hand side, that even after people achieve that first year of full sustained remission, which is a big achievement in and of itself, it takes another 5 years, roughly 5 years in these adult clinical samples, before the risk of meeting criteria for substance use disorder in the next year drops below 15%. Why is 15% important? Because 15% is roughly the annual risk of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder in the general population each year. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or drug use disorder in the following year, if you've already had it, takes roughly 4 to 5 years of continuous remission. So risk remains elevated for that initial 5-year period, even after people achieve that first year of full sustained remission. So this suggests that people often need some kind of ongoing recovery management and recovery monitoring service. And this is where I think mutual help groups can play a very valuable role. We've seen a growth in these entities over the last 40 years, as I mentioned, 50 years. Notably, Smart Recovery, others have come along like Refuge, Lifeline, Women for Sobriety, which is obviously focused mostly on women, Celebrate Recovery, which is a religiously focused one, which has grown a lot over the last 25 years. We've seen this these are data from our National Recovery Study. We see this growth in alternatives. And you see it's slow growth across the bottom in these secular and religious groups, mutual help alternatives to AA, as AA groups attendance have gone down, relatively speaking, across time, and others have grown. So we're getting, if you take that fitness center analogy, we're getting more fitness options for people to get fit for recovery, and that's, I think, good news. There is an emerging evidence base. Alison did a fantastic job creating that systematic review, and we've got more and more studies coming out on alternatives, including SMART. Sarah Zemore did this nice study which looked at people self-selecting into different recovery groups, including SMART, Women for Sobriety, AA, and Lifeline, and found similar outcomes for people who self-selected into these groups when you accounted for their goal, what they wanted to achieve as part of their recovery goal. So I think that's encouraging that, again, it's not so much about relative efficacy per se, as it is finding something that you can work out with. It's finding a machine, finding an activity, in this case, a mutual support group that fits for your particular style of recovery. So what I'm going to tell you about today is some results from our ongoing study, prospective study of different groups of individuals who are selecting into different recovery support options, including Smart Recovery. We have 368 people. They were recruited from the Metro Boston area in New England, as well as the Southwest in San Diego. Everybody, this is a focus on alcohol use disorder, and they were mostly severe alcohol use disorder, but people who were in Smart Recovery, we recruited them from Smart, but they were starting a new recovery attempt. So everybody in this study was starting off as in a new recovery attempt, self-defined new recovery attempt. They were starting to, to change again and to look to ways to help themselves get into recovery. And as you can see at the bottom here, there were 4 distinct groups. There were people who were in Smart Recovery when they started their new recovery attempt. There were people in AA. There were people who both went to Smart and AA. And there was a neither Smart nor AA group. Okay, so they were they didn't go to either Smart or AA. They may have attended other kinds of things, but they didn't go to any mutual help groups. These are the measures. So we looked at demographics, alcohol use disorder severity indicators, and alcohol use, functioning, quality of life and well-being, recovery resources and barriers, and treatment history. So what did we find? So these were the groups in terms of the ends. The neither group was the biggest. These were the folks who didn't choose either AA or SMART, but were starting a new recovery attempt. So there was a larger group there. And we had about 60 to 70 people in each of the other groups. So we had 63 in the SMART group, 72 in the AA group, and then 50 people who went to SMART and AA when they started their new recovery attempt. So within the last 90 days, they'd attended at least one of these different meetings, or both in the case of SMART and AA. And so what did we find across these different indices of demographics, substance use histories, treatment histories, and other variables, quality of life and well-being? Well, in terms of the sex breakdown of participation, it was non-significantly different. You can see it's roughly the same. About half were attending. Slightly more in the neither group were women. In terms of age, this was not significant. It looks like in the SMART group, it was slightly older, but it didn't reach statistical significance. In other words, there was a lot of variability in age across these different groups. In terms of sexual orientation, again, it looks like it might be different here for SMART on the left. but it was about equal when you account for the variability in terms of sexual minorities attending these different groups, about a quarter roughly. In terms of Hispanic ethnicity, again, this was actually non-significant. Looks like it might be, but it might be a power issue here. But you can see what's interesting descriptively is that the AA group here had fewer Hispanic individuals. They were all pretty low, of course, but SMART had the most here in terms of engaging Hispanic ethnicity individuals, although it was non-significant. Where there was a significant difference in terms of race was that SMART recovery was more likely to be white. It did not have any Black participants at all, or Asian participants, or Alaskan, American Indian and Alaskan Natives. It did have some multiracial, but for some reason there was no Black individuals or Asian or American Indian, Alaskan Natives in SMART recovery. There was about 20% were in the AA group were Black, and SMART and AA, as well as neither. In terms of education, the SMART group, again, was different. It was more educated. So substantially more, roughly twice as many people compared to AA had a BA or higher. Income was similar in terms of higher income in the SMART group relative to the AA group and the SMART and AA and neither group. So higher education, higher income. They were also more likely in the SMART group to be married or living as married compared to the AA and AA plus SMART group, but was similar to the neither group. And in terms of alcohol use disorder severity, there was a lot of, as you can see, severe disorder across all three groups, SMART AA and SMART plus AA. Where you saw the big difference was in this neither group. As you might imagine, people who did not seek any kind of external help tended to have less severe substance alcohol use disorder. And the SMART group had marginally more moderate substance use disorder compared to the SMART plus AA and the AA only group. In terms of consequences, again, SMART recovery had significantly fewer alcohol and other drug consequences compared to the AA only and the SMART plus AA group. And the alcohol use goals were broadly similar, with a slight difference between the SMART group was more likely to choose a moderation goal. You can see that on the right-hand side is where it differs the most in terms of the neither group, who are more interested in having, relatively speaking, of having a goal of controlled use. And then lifetime use of alcohol use disorder and mental health meds were roughly the same, apart from the neither group, as you can see here on the right. They were the ones that used those less, as you might guess. And in terms of prior hospitalizations and inpatient and outpatient treatment utilization, again, the SMART recovery group was different, had less utilization of these outpatient, inpatient, and detox residential services. Similar story with other lifetime recovery support service use. Generally speaking, SMART was different, particularly on things like recovery high school use, and less likely to use collegiate recovery compared to the SMART plus AA, as well as recovery community centers. Less criminal justice involvement also for the SMART group, less likely to be, again, commit to sobriety, slightly less, although it was still high. It was high across all these groups that were seeking help. So in summary, and I've gone through those quite quickly, but I think I can summarize the general picture. What we're seeing here again, this is a baseline when people are coming into the study and they've self-selected into one of these 4 different groups. We've learned, generally speaking, that compared to individuals who self-select into either nothing, no external service use, or AA or SMART plus AA, People who are choosing SMART tend to be more likely to be white, have high income, more education, more likely to be in a marital relationship or living with someone as if they're married, have lower consequences related to the alcohol use, are less likely to have utilized inpatient or outpatient services or detox, less likely to have used certain recovery support services, particularly recovery community centers, but have similar rates of medication use, both for alcohol and other psychotropic meds for other psychiatric conditions. Less likely is likely to have an abstinence goal, have lower criminal justice involvement, but have similar levels of quality of life functioning and self-esteem. Just a few limitations to keep in mind. Obviously, these are from two areas, New England and San Diego areas. They pertain to alcohol use disorder, primary alcohol use disorder, people starting a new recovery attempt. We cannot attest, it doesn't mean anything really yet in this particular analysis about the relative benefit of participation, but we hope to be able to report that soon as we are finishing up the data collection with the prospect. We're following these folks up for 2 years, so we'll be able to look at patterns of involvement, engagement, and also migration across into other groups as they go along in their recovery journey. So look forward to telling you more of the story down the road as we gather the data. But these are what we're finding so far in terms of participant affiliation and their characteristics. So thanks for listening, and I'll pass it back to Katie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. Really exciting data, and don't go too far away because we've got a few questions for you here. So the first one is, what are the major reasons in this study or in your prior work why some people don't engage with AA and might, I'm going to just add to this question, might engage in SMART over AA?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's finding the right fit, isn't it? I think it's, some people feel more comfortable, don't feel comfortable in AA, and they feel comfortable in SMART. And it may be something about the way that SMART recovery groups are run, the way that they're facilitated more by a trained person. That's more comfortable for certain people. The focus on kind of an evidence-based approach stemming from CBT, again, can be more appealing to certain people. To smaller groups in SMART, that could be more appealing. So there are different, and this is something we can learn more in qualitative research, which we've actually done, by the way, we've done another study in the context of this study, looking at that exact question, what people like and why they go to these different groups. So look forward to telling you that story. But I think it's just these different flavors, isn't it, of different groups that certain people like and they want to self-select into. And that's why it's so important to have these different options available, menu of options that people, just like a fitness center, as I say, that people can be attracted to and engage in and hopefully benefit from.
Yeah, I love that analogy. A couple of questions I'm going to put together is regarding field of employment, work history, and also religion and spirituality. And I believe you covered some of that, but wondering if you want to speak more to those differences by the groups.
Yeah, so the SMART group was more likely to be employed. I'm not sure if I had that on there or not, but they were more likely to be employed. They had higher income. They had kind of generally a more stable psychosocial picture compared to the other groups, including the SMART plus AA group, interestingly. But the, what was the other bit? Employment, Katie, what was the other bit?
Religiosity.
Oh, yes, religiosity. Now, I can't remember now. I don't think that was significant, and that's why I didn't put everything up. We had a lot of variables. But that was not significant. We do have a dimensional scale of spirituality and kind of spiritual practices. And I can't remember, actually, forgive me, exactly what came out there. But I think if it was significant, I would have put it up here. But I remember one thing that was interesting was that the spirituality in the SMART group was actually quite high, which kind of surprised me somewhat, because, kind of a secular alternative to 12-step and other more religious groups, that people were quite spiritual who were attending SMART recovery as well. Okay,
And then
back to you.
one more question for you, and then I'm going to save one of these for the end, but one more question around whether the study included individuals who were mandated by the court or other authority.
No, so these were all voluntary.
Okay, great.
Yep.
These last two questions I'm actually going to save for a more general discussion. And thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for your fabulous presentation. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Tom Horvath, who is a clinical psychologist who has specialized in addictive problems since 1985. And he's one of the co-founders of SMART and was president of SMART for 20 years. And he'll be speaking about future directions for SMART recovery research. And some of your questions we'll be tackling in that discussion. So take it away, Dr. Horvath.
Thank you, Katie. This presentation is organized around questions. I hope that these questions will be meaningful not only to the scientists, but the other audiences participating today. In some cases, I may have questions on the slide that may not have time for coverage in the discussion. And the first question is a theoretical one. It follows on from what we've been hearing, concerns SMART's unique contribution, if any, to mutual help. And I want to consider that question in the context of three items. One is what appears to be emerging as the equivalent effectiveness of mutual help groups. Now, this is both a question and a summary of findings. And fortunately, we have the study that Dr. Kelly just described and the PAL-2 study, the follow-up on PAL-1 by Sarah Zemore. So we're going to have some more data. We might actually somewhat firmly be able to say in 2 or 3 years that mutual help groups are, generally speaking, equivalently effective. This is a conclusion that doesn't seem to have disturbed anybody in SMART recovery too much. But the next context might. And this is some work done by Reddy and colleagues in the UK recently that suggested that across 30 different mutual help groups, the underlying activities were essentially the same: improving self-confidence, improving coping skills, etc., rather than there being separate mechanisms of action in each group. And I want to compare this to what we've been finding about CBT. SMART is often equated with CBT. The American Psychological Association a year ago released the Handbook of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. This is a 2-volume work, 1,600 pages over 50 chapters. If there are true believers in CBT, they can be found among the authors of these chapters. One chapter concludes CBT mechanisms of change have not been clearly elucidated. And another chapter states regarding psychotherapy in general, there is little empirical evidence for the notion that different processes are at work in treatments associated with different theoretical frameworks. So in psychotherapy, we appear to be concluding that psychotherapies are, roughly speaking, equally equivalent, and any component of them we could not say was evidence-based. It's the package that is evidence-based. So coming back to SMART and CBT, we couldn't apparently say that this tool from CBT or this tool in SMART is an evidence-based tool. It is simply part of an evidence-based package. And this led me once to say that it's not the tools that are working, which got restated, but not quite accurately, that the tools don't work. As we'll come back to them, the tools are very important to individuals in our groups. How they work exactly remains not entirely clear. Excuse me. And then I want to add this third piece, and Dr. Kelly was just talking about this. If he didn't say this directly, he nearly did. AA and 12-step facilitation interventions performed at least as well as established active comparison treatments, that is CBT. And with this comparison, I'm drawing the connection to the common factors of psychotherapy. I've listed them there. What appears to be necessary across all forms of psychotherapy is that the client, and this is individual therapy, the client and the therapist need to agree on what the goals are. They need to have established a game plan and a connection with one another, an alliance for moving forward. The client needs to feel understood, that's empathy, and respected, and the client needs to believe that the therapist is behaving in a genuine manner. That's in individual therapy, but presumably this also applies to groups, and presumably, and it does, although the additional component of group cohesion is a factor. And it may also apply across all of treatment and mutual help. What kind of underlying factors might account for all this? And a related question about the ceiling of effectiveness, because I didn't place it here, but apparently the effectiveness of psychotherapy over the last 40 some years has not increased. And we may also have hit the ceiling for the effectiveness of mutual help. So this is the analogy that follows up on the fitness center analogy. If you go to the fitness center, this shows you what you might be doing afterwards. And I imagine that at one point in the past, individuals might have argued that Italian or Chinese or Mexican food is the most healthful food. And who knows on what basis they would have made that argument. But once we discovered nutrition and discovered macronutrients and water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins and macro minerals and trace minerals, when we understood that, we could start to define what made a food nutritious. And if we look at fast food, we could also define what should be in food in minimal amounts or perhaps not at all. So in light of this food analogy, if SMART is not more effective, and if SMART is not substantially different, what is SMART's unique contribution, if any, to mutual help? Are we simply a different flavor? I noticed that Dr. Kelly actually used that term, flavor, and he is starting to answer this question: to whom does SMART appeal? This analogy, unfortunately, may not work as well in the UK, because I understand that food there is not as flavorful, but perhaps it will work around the rest of the world. There's a sample SMART meeting with Dr. Gerstein at the podium there. So SMART will not get a chance to make its unique contribution if it doesn't survive. So I now have a set of questions that I'm terming practical, because these require good answers if we are to move forward. Our biggest problem is lack of meetings, and then we are connected to the question of training. How much of training is in nutrition and how much training is in cuisine? I think a related question is, what is a minimally sufficient or effective meeting? What's noteworthy about all these studies of SMART recovery that we've been looking at, that Dr. Beck presented, is that the meetings are a kind of black box. We don't exactly know what happens in them. And I think one thing we can be certain of is that these meetings are not consistently conducted. There's not a firm protocol. We're dealing with volunteers in almost all cases. So scientifically, that's one issue that might need to be evaluated over time. But let me go back to the top of this slide. How do you think of a meeting? Is it primarily group therapy and the therapist, the facilitator is a junior therapist? Is it a seminar where the facilitator is a master teacher who doesn't lecture much but asks skillful questions and guides the discussion. Is it simply a lecture in which individuals are presented a curriculum, information that they are to learn by the facilitator, perhaps via a set presentation? Or an option I don't hear discussed much, but which I have proposed from time to time, is it a kind of networking event? So I invite your attention to the concept of networking event for a moment. To throw a successful networking event, you simply need to establish a time and place, identify who is invited, what kind of person. Let's say we're going to do a networking event for computer software salespeople. And that word goes out, and the networking event is relatively simple. Perhaps you invite people to share their names, their job title, and the company they're with. And then the host somewhat disappears and assumes that the participants will take charge of learning what they need to learn from one another. Of course, this is not a group discussion. This is multiple smaller discussions. But I'm suggesting, and this I think could be tested, that in fact, in meetings, this is a lot of what's going on as people listen to one another, and the significance of this meeting, if it could be shown to be effective, is that the training for it would be much simpler. And it raises the question then, are the more sophisticated meetings that SMART operates worth the effort that it takes to provide them? So coming back to this issue of how SMART facilitators should be trained, we could be asking questions about the prerequisites, who makes a good facilitator based on their history. If they were just learning meeting management, what would be necessary to do that? Rather than trying to recruit people who are high in empathy, which might require some significant effort, or training them in empathy, which might also require some significant effort, could we create something that I'm terming empathy light, which would involve a focus on thanking people for their contributions, their shares, acknowledging some of the key points of what they have said, something like, gee, that sounds like it was tough. I appreciate your sharing that with us. Thank you for being here. Would that be sufficient, and would it be easily trainable? So from this perspective, the classic tools of SMART recovery, at least in the US, cost benefit analysis and so forth, could, or I would say should, be considered as prompts to discussion and sharing rather than evidence-based tools which people must learn in order to be successful in SMART recovery. Also, a proper networking event has certain rules. They're not hard to follow. SMART's rules are a little more complex, but I think, well, I have attempted to capture here what I consider to be the essential ones. Participation not being required relaxes people. Confidential and free, of course. A conversational meeting, so no one dominates. We don't tell people what to do, and that includes allowing them to be free to use their own language. So if they want to call themselves an addict or an alcoholic, we should allow that. But we do stay on the general topic of focusing on addictive problems and, even more importantly, building a better life. There's been some controversy, not around the world, but in the US, on whether we're focused on abstinence maintenance or achieving abstinence or just making progress. I'll let that go for the moment. And the notion of actively engaging in SMART rather than talking about it. Over time in the operation of SMART meetings, I estimated the other day, since the pandemic began, I have conducted now about 400 meetings. So I'm feeling quite well versed in what happens in meetings these days. And these seem to be the kinds of rules that someone could enforce relatively simply with relatively less training. And would produce a minimally sufficient meeting. Now, in addition to training, we also need to pay some attention to recruitment and retention, because without that, we won't have the size organization that we need. And there are many questions around how to do this, which I think the organization and the scientists have not actually begun to consider. It, for me, suggests that if we're going to develop a culture of donating, which the organization wants to do to have a revenue stream, we could also establish a culture of volunteering and mentoring. But how do we do that, and how do we diversify the people who do volunteer? I want to remind you of an organization called Recovery International. This was founded in 1937. You might not have heard of it. I'm quoting from their homepage. Recovery International offers a cognitive behavioral training method which has helped people learn to identify and manage negative thoughts, feelings, and beliefs and behaviors that can lead to emotional distress and related physical symptoms. And from their Wikipedia page, based on self-control, self-confidence, and increasing one's determination to act. Now, even though AA had a head start on them by 2 years, Recovery International was founded in 1937, that 2-year difference won't account for the fact that AA has over 100,000 meetings worldwide, and Recovery International, as nearly as I can tell, has only a few hundred. I'm confident that SMART will survive, but will it thrive? We have here a comparison organization with what looks to me to be a very similar approach, but I would say is not thriving as much as it might. So this practical question about how we grow SMART is also needing to focus on SMART's impact in the community, because a community will support an organization that it perceives as valuable. And there are many potential impacts of SMART in the community. Towards the bottom of this slide, I'm focusing on, as noted, the lack of diversity in SMART. And one of my hypotheses is that to the extent that SMART presents itself as a program rather than a meeting, we could be perceived as a group of white, educated, well-off individuals who are imposing their approach to recovery and change upon this group that's already been imposed upon enough by them. A meeting could help pull for strengths. A program can suggest deficits. And I have heard many times from people who've attended their first cognitive therapy for depression, and they come out and say, oh my God, not only am I depressed, I don't even think right. And I think somebody could come out of a SMART reading possibly with that perspective, which would be problematic. So let's come back to this notion of program. As some of you know, I have argued against the idea of SMART as a program for a long time and proposed that instead it's a community of meetings. But in my requests of those who do view it as a program, to tell me succinctly what is the program. From what I have heard, I think the essence of the program is that you can think about your thinking. Whatever thought or impulse enters your mind does not necessarily mean that you need to act on it. This is an idea from Stoicism, roughly 2,300 years old. It's considered a foundation of CBT, that we can stand back and evaluate. But the biggest evaluation that most of our participants probably need to do is to consider their behavior in the context of relationships. To remind you, most substance problems begin in the teen years, the serious ones, not all of them. And that developmental process to young adulthood might well be disrupted. The evaluation that someone needs to do to decide that it's not worth acting on this substance urge is to consider not only the relationships they're in, but their own future self. So myself today might enjoy drinking, but myself in 5 years, 10 years, or longer, probably does not want to get cirrhosis. Progress for these folks includes improved relationships. And we say this, the opposite of addiction is connection. But the distinction that's important is that it's not change for others. Clinicians can tell you that when you change for someone else, your motivation will be short-lived. I'm not changing for my partner. I am changing to be a better partner. So in light of looking for underlying factors, the nutrition behind the cuisine, what I've just described is from developmental psychology, Robert Kegan, who's also at, or was at Harvard, the transition to the socialized mind, which is the transition that should occur in adolescence to young adulthood. It's a focus not just on rights and responsibility, not rights and desires, but also on responsibilities. Now, if you've spent any time with adolescents, you know that they are highly responsive about their rights. Why? I'm practically an adult. Why can't I choose to do this myself? They are not so big on responsibility to themselves of their future or their relationships. I also think that this developmental model, which is increasingly used in understanding psychopathology, may explain why the disease model is so enduring, because it's a recognition of how difficult it is to change to the fully socialized mind. So imagine taking a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old to the top of a skyscraper and asking them to look down at the sidewalk and street and say what they see. And the 5-year-old says, look at the tiny people. And the 10-year-old says, look how tiny the people look. The 5-year-old is captured by its perception and cannot rise above it. The 10-year-old has a concept of people and recognizes that there are no tiny people that he's looking at, but that this is another effect. I've pulled here the definition of craving from the DSM, a strong desire to drink that makes it difficult to think of anything else and that often results in the onset of drinking. The individual in the grip of a craving cannot stand back to observe it like the 5-year-old cannot stand back from observing a perception. These are changes that are also described by Piaget, Maslow, and others. And I am proposing that one way to look at the underlying changes that are occurring in SMART is that transition. When you talk to people, you get these kinds of answers. If you came across a group of individuals engaging in what's shown in this picture and ask each in turn, what are you doing? The answers you get might be, I'm laying bricks, I'm building a wall, I'm building a building, I am building a community center, I'm contributing to the development of my community, I am contributing to the development of humanity. And the expansiveness range of those answers describes different levels of development. Well, one upshot of Dr. Kelly's study, and I don't think this was planned, is that, because he don't think he realized it, is that in Massachusetts, SMART tends to be more emphasized as program. In San Diego, it's more emphasized as mutual help community. Possibly this will be a test. The numbers aren't very large. Only a very large difference between outcomes would be significant. But my prediction is that community is not going to have any worse outcomes. And in fact, it'll be easier to train facilitators. And SMART operating as a community, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these, but we need to pay attention not just to how meetings are conducted, but how the community thrives. And the larger question is really at the bottom: can a non-higher power community thrive? Recovery International has not. What will it take to make this secular community thrive? So starting next week, if you want the slides or the references, please feel free to email me at that address. I conclude that we still have much to learn about the black box of mutual help. It will be very helpful to make comparisons to other groups, but also to treatment. We do need to focus on mechanisms of change beyond tools. I hope that there will be some consideration of adult development as a factor in what's happening in all mutual health. And of course, SMART needs to grow substantially. I have some final questions. Will SMART be the science-based and self-transforming approach it promised to be? I want to thank Dr. Peter Kelly and the Global Research Advisory Committee for hosting this webinar. I do hope it becomes an annual event. And I'm wondering how referrals to SMART will be made in the future. I do sometimes refer to AA, and I say, well, if you want to, you can pay attention to the higher power and to the sponsor and to the steps. But really the important thing is that you go and listen to people, make some relationships, compare your story with their stories, and learn from people without necessarily buying into all of the ideology that goes with it. And the meetings could be very helpful to you. They don't do a belief test at the door. Go and gather what you can and build the relationships that you can. Will someone in the future refer to SMART in the same way? You know, you don't need to pay attention to all those tools and all those acronyms, but do listen to the stories, make relationships, and consider your problems in the light of the other problems and solutions that you're hearing. Or will there be multiple pathways within SMART recovery so that someone who wants to be tool focused can find a home there, and someone who wants to focus in another way will also find a home. So my vision for SMART, the organization, is that we have the scientists on one side of the bridge, with the GRAC in particular formulating information, sort of packages to be sent across the bridge that the organization transforms into meaningful messages for facilitators to carry the latest scientific knowledge through our facilitators and meetings into the world, because we are in times of increasing addictive problems, and the world definitely needs SMART recovery. We need to rise to our responsibilities to be the best organization that we can, and that will require very solid science to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horvath. And I have some questions specifically for you, and then I'll bring all of our panelists up for some additional questions. So Dr. Horvath, specifically for you, being an expert in the method is different from being an expert in addictive behaviors. What do you think about that?
I'm expert in the method.
I think being an expert in the SMART recovery approach is different from being an expert in addictive behaviors.
Well, I'm a psychologist, I practice and I see clients. I think that it's very important for me to know the kinds of things that happen for individuals who have addictive problems. And having listened to thousands of such individuals now, I have a large body of knowledge, but you can get something similar just by going to a mutual help group. I'm less personally focused on method, and I'm less concerned about method in meetings. I've conducted meetings in which we just keep going around the circle and people talk about what comes to them at the moment, which is not unlike an AA meeting, actually, where there's virtually no structure. And the meetings, my clinical sense of them is that they are quite effective and quite meaningful to participants. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question that's asked, but I'm more concerned about knowing addictive problems than about methods for dealing with them.
And I think I got some clarification here. So when the participants do not know 12-step or other methods, SMART works very well. It does not need to be compared or complemented. Would you agree with that?
True. There's no reason to make comparisons unless somebody's asking for it.
Yeah, great. And then So I'm going to open it up actually for all of the panelists for our last 15 minutes here together. Some really general questions that have come through that I think would be fun to discuss as a group. And the first is how online meetings have impacted any of what we've talked about today, particularly the data that Dr. Beck reported, Dr. Horvath, your experience of leading these meetings. How has COVID impacted SMART and in particularly in thinking about outcomes and mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I might take a punt just to begin with, and then feel free for anyone else to jump in. We actually did a little bit of work on this recently last year, and just in the process of writing it up, we spoke to both participants and facilitators who had experience of online groups only, face-to-face groups only, or a mixture of face-to-face and online. And interestingly enough, I guess one of the key take-home messages that I had from speaking to all of these people is that it very much came back to that kind of preference and flavor and choice and finding that thing that kind of works best for you. Some people adored online meetings, that it was something that was very convenient to them, and quite enjoyed the fact that they didn't need to have a chat to people before and after, because they found that a bit anxiety provoking. Other people really missed that opportunity to be able to actually build those relationships and have those connections. And so I think it's perhaps not necessarily a question of which one's better, but it's another option for people to be able to find something that fits best for them.
There may be some significant differences between people who will refuse to go to Zoom meetings, which is what I saw 2 years ago when my San Diego meeting network almost collapsed and people were almost enraged. I mean, they didn't even know who to be angry with. Many came back later, some have just not returned. I think they're two slightly different populations, but I don't know how to characterize them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sorry to jump in again, but just the we had it sort of had that different flavor as well between people who were attending the face-to-face groups and then were kind of forced to transition online versus people who'd only ever had experience of the online groups. Again, there feels like there's something different there, but I'm not quite sure what that actually is yet. Sorry, John.
No, not at all. The one thing that comes to mind, actually, not from, I mean, anecdotally, I could speak about kind of just impressions about different stories of experiences of online and in person, and the outrage and the upset when all the in-person meetings closed down. But in another study recently, we're doing another study actually looking at AA mechanisms right now, another big cohort study, interestingly, and it just came up last week actually that when we were looking at some of the data, that people, everybody was going to mostly online meetings, they felt substantially less safe going to online meetings than they did in person. Interestingly, and the RC, research coordinators said, just from picking up the conversation, was that because of all the Zoom bombing and people coming into meetings, that they felt less safe there than they do in the regular face-to-face meetings, which was, of course, getting that context that the Zoom bombing can be pretty upsetting. So that was an interesting little anecdote that came out of that. Out of that data point where people were feeling less safe, even though they were reporting, a lot of attendance online, but they were feeling less safe online, interestingly. So anyway, just to throw that out there. Yeah.
And speaking to that as well, just around the safety, we had some people, it was predominantly in sort of rural, regional communities where it was quite small. If people didn't have their video cameras on, there was a bit of concern around, is that my sister who's sat there, or, people on domestic violence orders and things like that, or perhaps involved in the child protection system, those sorts of things. The whole camera on, camera off flexibility could potentially cause a little bit of safety issues. Yeah, definitely lots of things that need to be considered when it comes to running an online meeting.
Yeah. Thank you all. I'm going to move to, we're getting a lot more questions now. And so a lot of questions about types of people who are coming to SMART, as well as potential referral to SMART. And so one comment about people with a background of science of some sort being more interested in SMART, potentially correctional settings and individuals in Australia who are more diverse, less well educated, and also in London, a more diverse group of patients coming to SMART. And so just wondering any thoughts on that. And then related is a question around referral bias and whether that could explain some discrepancies in demographics, whether certain treatment professionals might typecast when they refer people to specific programs, and any thoughts about any of that, who is coming to SMART, who's more interested in SMART, as well as kind of professional referrals, and more generally, what is being done to inform providers of 12-step alternatives to alternatives to AA and referring patients to those 12-step alternatives like SMART. So that was a lot, trying to get as many questions as we can in a little bit of time here.
Well, I'll take first stab at this. So John showed the cover of Broadening the Base of Treatment for Alcohol Problems, published in 1990. And in many ways, the world has hardly changed since the publication of that book, except for all this research on the effectiveness of AA, which a lot of professionals just didn't want to believe. And the traditional treatment world seems to me largely unchanged, not entirely. And I assume that SMART grows individual by individual as people within the traditional community hear about it, have realized some of their own concerns about the traditional approach. They don't particularly read research, and gradually we make friends and we network. Psychotherapists tend to be very open to SMART. That's what I think is going to have to happen. I'd love to see some research on the most effective way to disseminate SMART within a community. And we'd have lots of opportunities to start with a community that has no SMART at all and see what it would take to disseminate there. But of course, we need to be able to establish meetings there to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a catch-22, isn't there? Because, clinicians don't refer to SMART, because there's not that many in the, or they don't have the evidence base, and I think there's not that many in the community, and so, and yet they don't grow because we don't have the evidence base. We're not doing research on it. So that's that's what we're trying to change, of course, is to try and establish more evidence, and I think very significantly, we've got to have different options, got to have different, parts of the fitness center for recovery that can attract and engage people. I think that's key. Not everybody's going to want to go to SMART. Some people are. Some people are going to go to AA for different reasons. Some people go to both because, and this is an interesting group. And we've interviewed now 60 people who go to both. So we're going to have those data soon in terms of what they, why they go to both. What do they get out of SMART and what do they get out of AA? That's an interesting group, isn't it? So we're going to learn more about that. And I think, I remember being in the room at RSA, I don't know when it was, maybe 1997. It was 1998, maybe, when Dick Longabow was sharing the result, 3-year outcome results of Project MAT, which favored 12-step. And there was some psychologists in the room that were saying, well, it's not fair because 12-step has AA, right? And I was like, well, isn't that the point? But imagine this, right? Imagine if CBT had SMART recovery. Imagine if we were doing our CBT and then referring patients systematically, incorporating the SMART, and getting them, putting the idea, just like with 12-step facilitation, but with SMART facilitation. Because if you can get people going to SMART during CBT in treatment, just like 12-step, I think we'd see, similar outcomes and people would self-select, they'll be facilitated. And we know that we can amplify participation by clinically talking about it. I think we could do the same thing with SMART, with CBT and SMART. That'd be a great study, wouldn't it? We've actually got one plan to do that. So,
well, if we could extend your Cochrane review finding, we might conclude that SMART was as effective as CBT. And the challenge is just to get people to go. And I confess, I have not solved that challenge. One of the great ironies of my life is that well under 10% of my clients attend SMART Recovery. They can afford individual sessions, and that's what they want. And they don't want to be bothered by other people's problems in groups. And I try to persuade them that they're missing something there, but I have not been particularly effective.
Yeah. I don't know if you have more questions there, Katie. I could, we could go off on other things here, but maybe there's more specific questions to answer.
There's many that we won't get to all of them, but I do think one, the next one, I do want to make sure we just hit, if we can, of how did the findings and the kind of next steps inform future engagement with individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, persons of colors, as well as other marginalized communities. How do we increase the engagement in SMART of these groups and meet people where they're at to help them engage in SMART?
Well, I would say we need to do more outreach to the Black community and other minoritized groups, period. We found this in all kinds of recovery support services and opportunities that they're just not applying for. And I was speaking to the state of Massachusetts, for example, and the state was complaining to me, saying, "Well, we're putting out all these things for minority communities; they're not applying for them." And then they realized that they had to go out and meet them and get to know them and build trust. And I think probably. And Tom, you can speak to this better than me, but we need to do more of that with SMART too. Kind of go into those communities and meet them. And I think in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, Joe Erstein was telling me they've got groups in Chicago which are populated by many more Black individuals. So it may just be a function of kind of where it's at and who's running the groups and how they reach out, etc. So.
If we had the funding to place community centers in neighborhoods as Above and Beyond in Chicago has done, it's the pioneer in this area. I've attended it a few times, and you see Black, lower socioeconomic, homeless in some cases, relatively uneducated individuals who engage in amazingly interesting SMART recovery discussions. So there's nothing about what we do that won't work for, I think, a wide range of populations, but they have to be introduced to it.
Yeah, and I think that idea of the sort of co-design and collaboration is really important as well, that it's not something that we're kind of enforcing on people, that it's something that we're sort of coming alongside with. One of our colleagues, Elizabeth Dale, did some work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and working alongside them to understand whether or not the way that the format of SMART recovery, does that actually fit with the kind of traditional Aboriginal yarn, and being able to adapt to incorporate those cultural principles and being able to adapt the manual to make it more culturally sensitive, just to kind of have that I'm coming alongside you rather than enforcing as something on you. I think those kind of things, as John and Tom were saying about actually going into the community to get that sense of what's needed is really important.
Wonderful. So we are at time. Thank you so much, Ali, Tom, John, and the Global Research Advisory Committee, and of course, Smart Recovery International. And thanks to all of you for hanging in there. Sorry we did not get to all of your questions, but even more motivation to keep doing these webinars annually and get to come together across continents to talk about SMART and the research coming out of SMART. So thank you all. Great job.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for facilitating. Good to see everybody. Thanks, everybody.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks.
Want to have a lot of fun, get fit, and help support a really meaningful cause this April? Join the 30-day Take On Addiction Fundraising Challenge. Just sign up to walk, run, cycle, or choose your own activity to raise money for Smart Recovery, a global leader in mutual support services that empowers people everywhere to take back control of their lives and gain total freedom from their addictions. Sign up is quick and easy. Create your monthly fundraising challenge, invite your friends, form teams, share your results, celebrate your accomplishments, and get in the best shape of your life, knowing you're helping Smart Recovery smash the stigma of addiction and heal individuals in their communities everywhere. What are you waiting for? Just go to takeonaddiction.org and start helping people everywhere lead life beyond addiction today.